What? Ills.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. This is me, Ms. Rhonda B., coming to you with another exciting story. Today we have with us a gentleman who feels strongly that there is a direct correlation between what is going on in our streets today with all of our kids killing kids, so much domestic violence, and he says that there's a direct correlation between the juvenile detention center here in Cook County and some of that violence. According to what he has given me, it says the John Howard and National Juvenile Detention Association gave the center a favorable rating. Any EKC with the JDAI let youth out of the center at a rapid speed. Immediately following the assessment from the ACLU, they filed the suit alleging safety, educational, and mental health concerns. As a result of the lawsuit, the discipline on the youth and the levels of violence have risen. So we have a gentleman here with us today. He currently works in the system. He is a strong advocate that many of our youths are being lost to the street. He also feels that there's something that can and should be done about it. So in order to help him get his message out, we've invited him here to join us today because, as I tell you each and every week, everyone has a song to sing, a story to tell, and a message to be delivered. So today we have with us Mr. Clifton Little.
And they said that the facility, out of the 1,800 children, more than 2/3 of the children had two mental disorders, at least two mental disorders. So if the children are coming to this facility, it's the largest one of its kind. The service in the area as far north as Lake Cook Road on the north side, as far south as Will County or Kankakee on the south, and as far west as DuPage County. Every kid that is in trouble and or some of them for neglect cases in that geographical area, they actually come to that facility. Having said that, if 2/3 of them have mental disorders and if they're not serviced properly, they're coming back onto the street. But not only are they coming back onto the street, they're actually coming back onto the street worse than they did when they came in. And there has been numerous cases. The position in which I hold in the facility is I'm a counselor, like I said, for 21 years, but I kind of sit in a unique position in terms of all the children that are being charged as adults. I actually escort them downstairs so that the sheriffs can transport them over to 26 in California. Not only that, all the kids that are being released from the facility, I also escort them downstairs so that they can be released. So I'm actually able to see both ends of the spectrum. Kids who come in on the new, who start off in the process, as well as children that are being charged as adults on the back end of the process. So when most people are watching the news and they're seeing children get killed or children doing the killing, most people just see, man, we got all these kids doing these killings. When I sit and watch the news and I see kids getting killed, I actually can identify faces with these names, and I actually have escorted numerous of these children back and forth to court within inside of the facility. So having said that, I'm noticing that the pervasive and the vast amount of the killings that are happening with children that have been in the facility 5, 6, and 7 times. Just to brief give a couple, without mentioning names, scenario 111th Street, the melee that happened. Young man who allegedly committed that crime, he actually had just gotten out of the juvenile detention center not 3 months prior to that. He actually had just gotten out of the juvenile detention center prior to that, not 7 months prior to that. He had actually been in the detention setting or juvenile justice system 14 different times. Another case in point would be there was a University of Chicago doctoral student who had gotten killed a little less than 2 years ago. The young man who killed him actually had just gotten out of the juvenile detention center 8 months prior to that. We had a killing that happened on 119th Street in front of a strip mall on New Year's Eve night. The young man, they mentioned his name was Fred Couch. Well, this young man had just gotten out of juvenile detention center that November and ended up losing his life that December. He had been known to be in the facility at least 7 times. We had a young man in February who got killed in the middle of his block. They mentioned his name in the paper, and they said he went to Nancy B. Jefferson Alternative School. Nancy B. Jefferson Alternative School is a school that's inside the juvenile detention center. And this young man actually still had an electronic monitoring device on his ankle. Well, why am I alluding to all these cases? Something happened in the institution. Back in the 90s, there was an assessment of the juvenile detention center, which is about this book right here. This book has a gentleman named Michael Mahoney who came into the facility and assessed the facility, him and Earl Dunlap. They gave the facility a favorable rating back in the 90s. Not shortly after that, when this book was published, was May 1998. In June 1999, they filed a lawsuit saying that the kids was being abused, neglected, the place was filthy and everything else. But the sad irony behind it is everything that they said in the lawsuit is contradictory to this book that they actually published themselves. The person's name that the person who is currently running the facility, Mr. Earl Dunlap, Earl Dunlap's name is actually in the front of this book as a consultant. They actually infiltrated the facility by looking at its inner workings, how it worked from top to bottom, its psychology and everything. The place was running really well. That's why we didn't have an epidemic on our streets. But once they recognized how it ran, they put together this book to explain how it should run. But then they started tweaking little nuances to it to make the place implode. Mr. Earl Dunlap's contention would be that they didn't make it happen, that the problems had started to happen, and so now they're there to fix it. My contention is the book never says that the place was running bad. And my contention is everything that they said you should do in this book, they did in reverse, and therefore they actually has made the place implode and fall apart. Having said that, the ACLU filed a lawsuit, which is Mr. Benjamin Wolf. Mr. Benjamin Wolf is the lead attorney for the ACLU. They filed this lawsuit based upon 4 children's claim. Those 4 children never received a dime, but there's documented evidence that Mr. Benjamin Wolf received $370,000 in attorney fees for this particular case. Not only that, we have a mental health in the facility called Isaac Ray Center. Isaac Ray Center, their last contract was $9.2 million for a 42-month period of time. Now they have a new contract, which is for $16 million, which would be for the next 4 years after September of this year, which consists of, back then, the first contract was 14 psychiatrists and psychological staff, but now they've boosted up to 24. But the population of the institution is coming down, but the amounts of money that's being spent in the institution is going up. My contention is this, is that they're giving our children a lot of psychotropic drugs to control them now, opposed to we used to use a discipline mechanism in terms of what is called putting a kid in his room. If a kid assaulted another child back then, during the time of this assessment, that kid went into his room for 3 days. Now, there's no bars, there's glass doors, and the kids were always monitored. But one thing was sure, that the 2 kids who was fighting one another would be in a room right next to each other. They start off talking about each other's mother, everything else. By the time the 3rd day comes around, they're friends and they've worked out their differences. So when they came back out of the room, they were on better terms. Well, now they stripped that down where a kid, if he assaults another kid, he goes in for less than 24 hours. Immediately upon them doing this, what happened is the kids became more violent and more volatile, and they would use terminology, man, I will whoop you. I won't get nothing but 24. So therefore we know that immediately upon them making that change, based upon the ACLU going into the courts, because the county never fought it, they pretty much gave them what they asked for. Their levels of violence went up. Then they brought in some monitors to monitor the institution. Upon them bringing in monitors, they start scapegoating the staff, making the staff become apprehensive about doing their job. Mind you, in the book they said if the staff seems apprehensive about doing their job, the place will become more violent. But they tend to have made the staff become apprehensive by, quote unquote, if a kid had an allegation that a staff hurt them in some type of way, they would literally take that staff and put them in what the staff in the building coin as the penalty box. The penalty box consists of an area where the security work when you first come in the building, where everybody can see you. Okay, now no counselor has ever lost their job based upon abuse of a child in the facility. Mind you, no kid has ever committed suicide in the facility. Since the facility was built in 1973, there's only been 2 children prior to this time who had escaped from the facility, but they were both apprehended. The institution was actually world-renowned in terms of, we used to do conferences all over the United States. This is how they ended up coming to know us. In 1996, 93 to 97, when they did this assessment, the budget was $22 million. Since Mr. Earl Dunlap, the person who assessed the facility, has been in the facility, he has literally bloated the budget now to $41 million. Mr. Dunlap actually makes $300,000 a year, $25,000 a year, and he lives in Effingham, Illinois. The presidential towers is also given to him to live in terms of where he stays while he's here. He gets on the train and he works 4 days a week. He gets on the train and goes to Effingham every Friday. So while he's here, the county pays for his place to stay at Presidential Towers. The other person that's in second in charge, her name is Brenda Welch. Brenda Welch was instrumental in this in terms of, she was part of those monitors who first came in to intimidate the staff, to make the staff apprehensive about doing their job. Well, over time, she was the one who wrote an initial report that said that the county wasn't meeting their obligation. Well, Brenda Welch now is the second in charge, and she makes $20,000 a year. $20,000 a month. And so between Earl Dunlap and Brenda Welch, they're both making $500,000 a year running the facility right now. The school area, our children, there was a riot, if you look in the paper, for February 18, 2008, there was a riot inside of the juvenile detention center under Mr. Earl Dunlap's watch. We had never had a riot in that facility in my 21-year tenure. During that particular time, there was 70 kids in a location that was in a riot. Mr. Dunlap used that to go into the federal courts and say that there was a shortage of staff, and as a result of a shortage of staff, he needed to bring in emergency staff. So what he did was brought in a security firm called Wackenhut Security. Now, Wackenhut Security was supposed to be there for only 6 months. They're still there, and they weren't supposed to be working directly with the kids. They were supposed to be subsidizing in terms of working at night when the kids were asleep, where the veteran staff would have to work days because they were not to come in direct contact with the children. Well, they're still working there, and now we actually escort kids around our facility with handcuffs on. We had never done that before. The facility was actually a village. So Wackenhut Security also run our home electronic monitoring devices. We actually have 150 kids on average that are in the community on electronic monitoring devices. Each one of those electronic monitoring devices costs $4,000 a piece. Okay, Wackenhut Security also owned those. Earl Dunlap manipulated the courts by doing one thing. All the people that were supposed to be working in strategic positions as counselors, he literally took them out of their positions, created new positions, then went back to court and said he had a shortage of counselors, in which he made them something else and said that he needed to bring in an emergency security firm. That's how he brought Wackenhut Security in there. So as a result of this, we're seeing the whole environment in the institution has actually changed to the point that the violence is so high that we have glass doors in the facilities. Like I said, there's no bars. These glass doors cost $400 a piece to fix. The kids have become so violent that they're starting to smash glass doors to the point that we've had 185 glass doors to get smashed alone last year for $400 a piece. Mr. Dunlap's contention is, prior to that, in this assessment book, in a given year, we may have, at the best, 35 glass doors to be broken. In the last 6 months, from September up through February, the institution spent $3.6 million just based upon vandalism alone. because the kids are out of control. The staff are intimidated by Mr. Dunlap and him, and it's my contention that they're trying to make the place implode because Mr. Dunlap has been known to tear down juvenile detention facilities and not manage them properly, because part of his credentials is the architectural design and development of correctional facilities. Wackenhut Security has been a part of privatization of facilities, but not only that, Mr. Dunlap was down in Sangamon County in '96, where he had a researcher to research a juvenile detention facility, and that researcher would not tell him what he wanted to hear in terms of they wanted to tear that facility down. But that researcher said that that facility had some life left in it. So since he would not alter his research, even though they tried to give him $10,000 more, what he did was he took the man's research, and the way I was able to find out about it is it was on the internet where this researcher actually took them to the Supreme Court under Judge Rehnquist. That they took that research and he was claiming copyright infringement. As a result of that copyright infringement, he lost, the researcher lost. Dunlap and them took his research, got a different researcher named Boris Zemer to alter that research, and then they promoted that altered research and discredited Edwin Kennedy, who was the researcher at the time. I'm here to tell you that they ultimately tore down that juvenile detention facility. In the early 90s, the federal government have been given millions of dollars to rebuild juvenile detention facilities. This is the new Jim Crow that a lady named Michelle Alexander talks about. She writes a book called The New Jim Crow. This is the new Jim Crow. Mr. Earl Dunlap, the ACLU, the National Juvenile Detention Association, with Mr. Earl Dunlap, the John Howard Association, which Mr. Michael Mahoney, whose name is in this book as well, who did the assessment. Mr. Mike Mahoney, mind you, had been indicted for taking kickbacks from prisons for putting vendors in there. He was later acquitted of it. But now, we used to have where parents could bring their own shoes for them to wear, bring their own toiletries, bring their own snacks. They used to be able to visit up on the living unit so that they could see everything was going on. The John Howard Association proposed that they not do that anymore. They literally built a visiting room that can only hold 15 kids at a time to visit so that no one could go upstairs. They took the transparency out of the institution. Now what they do is they provide gym shoes for the kids through vendors. They provide snacks to the kids through vendors. And so as a result, money's being made through these vendings. Wackenhut Security, their contract was for $1.8 million. Therefore, along with the leg monitoring devices, like I said, those cost $4,000 a piece for them to do that, and as well as they lease the electronic monitoring boxes for $33 a day. So these are all the vending processes that they brought into the facility. Prior to this, and it's important that you have a descriptive of what it was like before this happened. Prior to this, the institution, we didn't even wear uniforms. It was more like a village concept. You know, Ron Huberman of the Chicago Public Schools says they need mentors for kids, especially at-risk youth, where all of your at-risk youth at some point typically ends up in here. They were literally meeting men like myself who were actually doing a lot of mentoring because we fed them, we clothed them, we made sure they went down to school, and while they were in school, we sat outside their classroom, so if the teacher had any difficulty, the teacher would actually come and say, so-and-so need to come out the classroom. We would have him come out the class, we would talk to him about what his issues are, his conflict, help him to understand how to deal with that, and send him back into the classroom. So there was a lot of mentoring that were going on, and it was a true village mentality and concept. It had no jail feel to it at all. It was a village. What is happening now is those glass doors that were shattered, they're now building steel doors in the facility for the kids so they can keep it in-house. We had 102 kids to go to the emergency room at Stroger Hospital last year just for fights alone. The year before that, we had 98 kids to go to the hospital for just fights alone. Both of these were during Mr. Dunlap's administration when he's supposed to be a nationally recognized expert in his given field. Prior to that, in this book, we would have maybe about 50 assaults and maybe about 20 that would just go to the hospital in a given year, just to kind of give you a comparison between the then and the now. And it's important that the public understand this, because on here I talk about the politics, the infiltration, and the economics. I mentioned some of the economics, but I didn't talk to you about the politics. A lot of the politics had to do with, back in the day, we had certain ministers who had their children who was working there. People knew people. A lot of people got their jobs based upon who they knew that was there. And that wasn't the problem. The problem was these individuals actually stripped the system that made the place fall apart. But the way in which they were able to infiltrate through politics, they started putting a lot of politicians' names in the newsprint based up on the juvenile detention center and hollering patronage. And in them doing that, a lot of your politicians started to bag off. You know, you had prominent politicians like, for instance, one preacher from Bishop Ford Freeway. Bishop Ford's grandson actually used to work in the juvenile detention center as assistant superintendent. And there's other preachers whose granddaughter used to work there as an assistant superintendent. And so when they started to do this smear campaign, all of your politicians backed up off of this. And that's the reason why the predominance of our African American politicians aren't saying nothing about this issue. They talk about NRA as far as gun rights, and they marching on these gun shops, but isn't it true that we've always had guns? During my time growing up in the city of Chicago, we've had guns. It's not the guns that's the problem, it's the way in which kids are perceiving and dealing with the guns, and the way in which you change their mindset about their own lives that's important. And I'm saying to you, because this institution now is letting kids go just as quick as they come in, because they're trying to reduce the population so quickly, what they're doing is, I'll give you an example. Had a young man just leave to go to Cook County Jail just 2 days ago. This young man had came into the facility about 9 months ago, and he came back just recently. He said to me, "You don't remember me, do you?" I said, "Yeah, I remember you." I said, "What you was in here for last time?" He said, "I had a .357 Magnum." I said, "So what happened?" He said, "They let me go 3 days later." I was surprised. And they let him go home on electronic monitoring. Not 7 months later, he comes back for armed robbery. Okay? He just turned 17 2 days ago. And so on your 17th birthday, if you do a crime that's an adult violation, you actually go back. You actually go over to 26 in California, because at 17 years old, you're considered an adult in the justice system if you do an adult crime. And armed robbery, sexual assault, attempted murder, vehicular hijacking, murder, those are considered adult crime. And so on your 17th birthday, you go back. I said that to say that they're now letting children go back to the street at such an alarming rate for gun cases. Last November, they opened up a courtroom that was just for children who had gun cases. Every Wednesday, we had at least 50 kids to go to court for gun cases alone. And a lot of these children, they're letting come right back to the street on those electronic monitoring devices that Wackenhut Security owns. And so the general public need to be made aware of this. Two things happen simultaneously.
Does anyone ever ask the kids where they get the guns from?
Well, I have.
Where would 50 kids get them from?
I ask them all the time. And predominantly where the guns come from is from burglaries. They burglarize somebody's home, and they actually will steal their gun out of their house. And that's where a vast amount of the guns are coming from as well. And so there's two things that simultaneously happen that we need to pay attention to. One, when they stripped the discipline out of this institution because they was trying to reduce the overcrowding, they wanted to reduce the overcrowding, but they also stripped the discipline at the same time. So they're letting the kids go at such a rapid speed, but at the same time, when they come in contact with the facility, they don't have the discipline that they had before. Those two things simultaneously has equated to an epidemic on our street. And if you think I'm kidding, the vast amount of the children that we service in that facility are from the west and the south side of the city of Chicago. And the predominance of the murders and the shootings that are taking place are predominantly from the west and the south side of the city of Chicago. And so this is the message that I would like for the community to know and to understand what is going on. Who handles the budget? Right now, Cook County.
Who hires whoever's in charge of the Cook County facility?
Based upon that bogus lawsuit that was brought forth, Benjamin Wolf, who was that elite attorney, he and Michael Mahoney, who I told you had been indicted for taking kickbacks from prison, the two of them recommended to a federal judge that Mr. Earl Dunlap run the facility, because the facility right now is in receivership in the federal courts. So it was a whole ploy to get it to that point, to push it to receivership so that they can run it and take it over. That's what they were doing, okay? And so there was nothing that the county could do to appease them as they were going forward. The county never wanted to fight them in court because they didn't want to bear the expense of a long, drawn-out court battle. But little did they know, they're bearing a major, major expense now, given this process.
So now, unfortunately, 30 minutes go by really too quick, and you have a lot to say, and that's a lot more that we need to know about this situation for both angles. First of all, if there's any truth to it, then obviously everyone needs to know. And if there is not any truth to it, then we still need to understand why it's coming out to seem like it's that way. So your story is called The Untold Story.
Correct.
And then you don't have a website? Do you have a website?
I have an email address, which is the Untold Story, the number 4, letter U, at yahoo.com.
So I want to encourage anyone who have any questions that want to follow up, some follow information, to give him an email at The Untold Story.
Number 4, letter U, at Yahoo.
Okay, and then I'm also going to follow up with him on a series of articles so that we can try to get a better understanding of this. Because a lot of it's not making sense. I can see the correlation of what you're saying, but I'm not understanding how in a city as big as Chicago, a state as large as Illinois, something so serious can be taking place and there's no powers to be that's looking in and say. And then plus another concern is the university. They research and study everything. So have you contacted any of the universities so that they can say, well, let me research this or let me study this?
The University of Chicago is actually doing a survey of our children right now in the facility. They call them cognitive behavior training, where they're examining half the kids, and the other kids, they're letting them do whatever, and they want to see if their approach is going to work, because they're trying to change the philosophy inside the facility. So the University of Chicago is totally well aware. Mr. Benjamin Wolf is actually out of the Northwestern Legal Clinic. So he knows about it, and that university knows about it as well.
Now, you know what, as I bring this to a close, I'm going to talk with my sister friend, Maureen Forte, and then perhaps see if she thinks this is a good idea. If perhaps you and herself and Reverend Bailey, are you familiar with Reverend Bailey from Probation Challenge?
No, I'm not.
Okay, well, he's a very astute person with an excellent program. And when you keep talking about this monitoring system, that brings me in mind, because he had a very effective program that they shut down. So it seems like to me that if they have young people on the monitoring system that they're sending out into the street, into homes, and they need to be educated and trained, that would be a direct corridor to what he was doing. So some powers to be shut down his program. This program is out of control. So, and he's a very wise man. So I would like to have maybe a round table discussion or taping with him to see if he sees a correlation here. In the meantime, we are out of time, and thank you for joining us. This is me, Ms. Rhonda B.
What? Eels.